Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast.
Hi, this is Olivia, and today we've got quite a special episode for you. We launched this podcast at the London Book Fair in March, and we thought it would be a nice idea to invite some of our authors and editors to come and record some interviews for us. Today we're going to share my conversation with Dr. Emelyne Godfrey and Professor Patrick Parrinder. They're the editors of our collection The Open Heart, which is a new title in our Beyond and Within series, and is essentially a collection of the writing by Catherine Wells, who was the often overlooked wife of H.G. Wells. And this collection marks the first time that her unfinished novella, The Open Heart, has ever been published, so it's quite exciting for us. We're really honoured as a publishing company to accommodate that milestone and hopefully bring her back to the modern day. Let's go and hear from the very lovely and knowledgeable Patrick and Emelyne.
Okay, well, I'm Patrick Parrinder. I'm president of the H.G. Wells Society, and we're here to talk about the one book by Catherine Wells, who was his wife, and of course there's a great interest nowadays in authorless wives. But she was very special, I think, and that comes through in the book, and I know you think that, Emily.
Definitely, and I think it probably wasn't very easy to be married to H.G. Wells because he was obviously highly talented, full of energy, and I think some of that energy was directed in all kinds of chaotic and crazy places, and she had to manage it, as well as manage, the social life around that, to all the people who came to visit, all the crazy ball games that they would play at home, and including all the first aid injuries that resulted, as well as just making guests feel comfortable. So she had an enormous amount of juggling to do in her life, just being married to Wells.
But she also had a flat of her own that she took in London, where she went to write, and H.G. Wells never went there until after her death. And that's where she wrote most of these stories. She had a very different attitude to literature and life to her husband. I mean, unlike him, she loved the stories of Catherine Mansfield, Virginia Woolf.
Yes, they were very Mansfield-esque.
She read Proust, which he couldn't stand. She was more of a modernist in many ways than he was, don't you think?
And I think also there's this wistfulness about her work too. There's this sort of stop and contemplate, what's about to happen here. So, for instance, one of my favourite stories is The Dragonfly, and it's this idea that the adults are getting very excited by this specimen, this creature that they've seen in the garden, and that something is about to happen which is going to change its life dramatically. But their lives continue, and obviously the wee boy as well, his life has been changed by this event. And it's this kind of, let's stop and reflect on how these things are changing. It's almost like these kind of, in a sense, almost like a pause, like time stops, I find sometimes with her work.
So she died of cancer in 1927, and she'd published 2 or 3 stories, I think, by then, very few. H.G. Wells goes to the flat after her death, finds all this published and unpublished writing. He makes a collection of her stories, which he publishes the following year with a long introduction talking about her life and his life with her. But he leaves out the one story that we've given the title to this book, The Open Heart. It's the longest, it was unfinished. He was obviously fascinated by it. I mean, he writes interestingly about it, but he never published it. And we came across the typescript, which was transcribed by another Wells scholar some 20 or 30 years ago. This is being now published for the first time.
I think also there are some very strong themes of utopia as well. And I think also it's interesting how with some utopias you have a disaster that starts off the narrative. So again, there's a shipwreck in this one, and then it's then she ends up and then the narrator ends up in this place that's so beautiful that there's nothing to be scared of, and the creatures are sort of taming away. You don't have to worry about burglars or anything dangerous, and it's
she's completely alone there.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's the last man kind of Mary Shelley narrative as well.
And it's unfinished. It's a curious mixture of fiction and essays. I mean, it's an imagined character who's actually 20 years younger than Catherine Wells herself was. But she writes a great deal about her childhood, her adolescence, her struggles with religion and the way that you were brought up then, her rejection of belief in God and so on, her discovery of science, which was something she has in common with H.G. Wells. They originally met because she was one of his students in a biology class in the 1890s. And so it's a fascinating mixture of memoir, self-analysis, and this semi-utopian fiction.
Yeah, but there are many sort of anxieties that pervade these short stories, and some of them, for instance, are health anxieties. So you have the fear of the loss of sight, and that kind of theme comes up in The Open Heart as well as prominently in another story too. And then there's this idea of mental health, how fragile that is. So when the body goes and the sight goes, then the equilibrium, the mental equilibrium might go as well. And there's some characters who are almost pushed to the brink a few times. So whilst her work is very wistful, you can see that sometimes sanity is hanging by a thread.
And there's a Gothic aspect.
Gloomy, I know.
Yeah, there's a Gothic aspect to it. I mean, it's a curious mixture of fantasy stories and some very realistic stories. And you constantly get this sense of confinement.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
And the fear and the loneliness that can arise. And they're all centered on women's sense of exclusion, confinement, sometimes persecution even, you know. I mean, there's even a suicide motive in one or two of the stories, isn't there?
I wonder whether or not any of that applied to her feelings sometimes as well. She underwent various health problems herself as well. She had quite a large operation at one point too. So, and then one of her sons had appendicitis, which became quite acute, and they had to operate. So you wonder whether or not some of this pervades her fiction, that this idea of, you know, healthy and energetic one minute and suddenly, you know, death and destruction the next.
Yes, there's also still quite a bit of mystery about her, I think. You know, to start with, everybody knew her not as Catherine Wells, but as Jane Wells. And her real name was Catherine, but it was Amy Catherine. So, she adopted the name Catherine Wells for her publications, the few that there were. It's a sort of different personality there that's a bit hard to pick up. And that's one of the fascinating things about reading her stories, I think. And, we could only wish she'd been able to finish The Open Heart. But she actually seems to have abandoned it before she got ill at the end of her life.
Yeah, and you sort of wonder whether or not, if we'd had more of her voice in a sense, like say in the form of, I guess, extensive diaries or these kinds of sort of sources, that would be a great way to bounce off her fiction against what she wrote privately about herself.
But hadn't you thought of writing a biography of her, Emily?
I wondered. The only problem is that I'm not sure my views on Wells are going to be very popular. I've been really interested in psychology recently. I've been making quite an in-depth study of just myself personally, and reading and YouTube and things like that, and various groups I belong to about psychology and Machiavellism and narcissism and things like that. And I thought, he must be some kind of grandiose narcissist, because Wells really needed the attention from people. He really needed admiration, but he also had this self-doubt that went along with it, and these outbursts. So you have one minute he's very excited and very energetic, the next minute it's like, he's telling off the nurse for feeding the wrong food to one of the sons. And I think there was some elements of sort of narcissistic behaviour there. So you obviously can't diagnose him as a narcissist, but you can sort of say there were some traits there. I don't know how well that would go down, but it would make a really interesting study, I think. But I don't know. I'll see how I get on with that. I mean, I would have a working title as well, which is quite exciting, and I live very near to where she lived, so I really can get into her mindset. I just need to drive 10 minutes down the road, and
that sounds like a really interesting project.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, so you
know each other and are involved in because of the H.G. Wells Society.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say, what brought you to that, and then from there, what brought you to the Catherine Wells side of things? Because you know, 30 years ago is when you said that the transcription was made. Yeah, tell me about that journey.
Yeah, well, the H.G. Wells Society, it's an international society. Of course, we welcome new members all the time. And, you know, we have a website and people send in queries all the time and some of them join us. We have an annual conference, usually an academic conference. We publish an annual journal and we have some social events.
But what actually got you specifically into Wells? How did you find Wells?
When I was a kid, there were two authors that I read again and again. And one was H.G. Wells and the other was Mark Twain. And then I found myself at university studying English, and I discovered that Mark Twain is viewed as a classic American writer. And everybody thinks H.G. Wells, in those days they all thought he was rubbish because, you know, he wasn't Henry James, he wasn't Joseph Conrad, so on. So I knew this was wrong, and I did my PhD on Wells, and about that time some other people began to get interested in Wells. I mean, one of the first literary critics that I read about him was David Lodge, the great campus novelist who's just died and who became a friend eventually. So there was a rediscovery of H.G. Wells, I think. He died in 1946. He'd written about 100 books, which was probably far too many. And, it took a long time after his death. But now, of course, there's a huge amount of interest. And you couldn't go to university studying English probably without doing a book by Wells. But that certainly didn't happen when I did my English degree in the 1960s. How about you?
I got into Wells through The War of the Worlds, the Jeff Wayne 1978 album. My father had that at home, and I just remember the crackling as the vinyl started up in the last years of the 19th century. No one would have believed, and it's like, woo, so exciting. That still sends tingles down the spine, that bit.
I'm just jumping in here to introduce our Desert Island Book segment. This is a part of the podcast where we're going to ask the person that we're talking to basically choose 5 books that they would bring to a desert island. This actually works particularly well for this interview, as The Open Heart by Catherine Wells is a novella that takes place on a desert island. Right, enough from me. On to Emelyne and Patrick's books that they would bring to a desert island.
Can we go on to the desert island book?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know how many it is.
I think I've narrowed it down to about that. I suppose my first one of my favourites is Thin Air, and that's by Michelle Pavor, and I love this novel. If I were to write a novel, I want to write a novel like this. It's got mountains, death, destruction, a haunted rucksack. It's got brotherly tensions, if you like. It's got everything in there, and it's got some high altitude stuff going on too. It's about a group of men in the 20s, and they go to Kanchenjunga, which is the 3rd highest mountain in the world, and then something terrible has happened a few years previously, and they find out how it affects them. It's called a ghost story, but the rucksack is so creepy, honestly. Like you wouldn't look at a rucksack ever again in the same way. But there's just some beautiful turns of phrase as well, and it's just I don't know how famous the book is, but I loved it. I've probably read it about 4 times now.
What about the next of the others?
I actually love Uncanny by Danny Robbins, another ghost story. He just writes in such a human way. He talks about things that have scared him, like for instance, he went to one of the westerlymost tips of the of Ireland. I think it's Skellig Michael, I think the island's called. And he said it was absolutely terrifying because it was all the stones were really wet, and they had to go up this tiny little path and go back down it again. And he thought he was going to die. And he said, so think about moments when you were really scared. And then he relates that to how people describe scary moments where they see aliens or things that they can't understand. And he actually said fear makes you eloquent. you really remember things. So I think he's got such a lovely kind of human way of relating his own life stories to what's actually going on in the narrative that he has to tell about the other accounts. Other ones are, I'm actually really enjoying Let Them by Mel Robbins at the moment. Because I live in a village and it's just driving me nuts. And I'm literally every day going, let them, okay, let them blow leaves again for the 5th time today, you know, let them park there. And this 2-part thing, it's like, let them do something that, you know, I'm not happy with that. And then let me think about, okay, I'll put on some headphones. Or, you know, it's like you're stuck on a desert island. It's like that ship has gone off. So let it go off and let me think about a way to, like, you know, increase my signaling technique.
That's very interesting. I like that. Do you have any more? Or should we go to...
I do, and I'm just remembering what they are. I will let Patrick...
memory test. Should we go to Patrick?
I always thought, you know, on the radio program they allow you one book apart from the Bible and Shakespeare. I always thought I would take a bird guide. So, you know, if there's any wandering albatross or pelican or whatever comes inside, I would know what it was. But no, I don't take something to read, obviously. And since I'm president of the Wells Society, you might think I'd take H.G. Wells, but I won't, because the books of his I love best. I know so well they'll be in my head anyway. So I'll take something I don't know as well, which influenced H.G. Wells, which will certainly take me out of myself on the desert island, but also remind me of some of the ghastly things going on in the world outside, which hopefully I'm protected from by being stuck on the island. And that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm going to take Frankenstein. And to add to that, well, I thought, you know, you want a book you can mull over. So I'll take a book of poetry. And the poet that I've tried to read but never read enough of, and never read with enough concentration, despite teaching him occasionally over the years and so on. Well, since I'm taking Mary Shelley, it's got to be Percy Shelley. So I'm going to take Shelley's poems and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And a bird book.
And I might take the collected box of Sherlock Holmes as well, because it's just every time a crisis comes along, like, what's the last chapter of my PhD? I don't know. And suddenly I start reading and I go, oh, that's the last chapter. Great, Sherlock Holmes and weaponry. That's one of the chapters. So it's almost like when there's a crisis that comes along, he pops up. Or I get offered to review another book of Sherlock Holmes or somebody else's book on Conan Doyle, and it's like almost like a little sign, like, here's something to focus on. So he's like a little bit of a kind of a wee bit of a hero figure there for me as well.
That was great. Talking of desert islands and Catherine Wells altogether, just going back to the open part, do you have an idea of what the ending would have been? What note it would have ended on? Do you ever think about that, or do you just sort of, it's better to leave her in the, you know, the unknown?
I think there wouldn't have been much that we don't have. Yeah. I think, you know, the reason why she gave it up, she'd probably reached some sort of mental block or emotional block in her own relation to it. But it seems to me, if you look at some of the other stories, suicide has got to be a possibility, but she didn't want to end it on it ends on a slightly unhappy note, but she didn't want to take it that far. I think that's why the block comes in. As I say, I think what is there is puzzling enough, and there probably wouldn't have been much more.
Yeah, I think some of the stories do end on that sort of yikes kind of element, like, you know, the dragonfly, and there's another one as well where two women they're going to move in together, and then it's all really happy, and then suddenly this guy comes along, and
it's got to be a guy, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's almost like he's almost some kind of like goblin kind of figure as well, and that's also sort of kind of ending. So I don't know. I mean, it's I think she has enough of these bad endings like that, I think.
What made you come together whilst in the society? I mean, you're both in the committee, you're the president, you're on the committee.
I'm in the committee, yeah.
So
Ex-chair.
Yeah.
What made you talk to people just about getting this book made? What sparked that?
I suppose, I started working on Mrs. Pankhurst's Bodyguard, which was my previous project, and I was interested in giving a voice to women who had written texts. So, for instance, the lady I wrote about, Kitty Willoughby Marshall, she had her autobiography, which was at the Museum of London, and I really thought she needed a book to herself. And then I thought, well, hold on, actually, Catherine Wells has, there's some stuff here. And that's kind of how that went. And then Patrick said, yes. And it wasn't really a discussion as such, it was more like, let's get on with this.
Yeah, and we've worked together so many times before, but I remember you particularly for 2 conferences that you were organising or co-organising. We did one on the centenary of Anne Veronica, Wells's feminist novel, and then you did one on Wells and William Morris, and that led to a book, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And I'm in the book and very pleased to be in it.
I think we've got loads of amazing stuff there. Is there anything more you want to talk about with the book?
It's especially been great to work with Flame Tree as well. We've both worked with Flame Tree before, so it was
very grateful to Flame Tree. But also, there are 2 members of Wells's family, great grandsons or whatever of Catherine Wells, who encouraged us to do this. And somewhere we think maybe the manuscript or whatever of The Open Heart is still around, but unfortunately they hadn't been able to disinter it. Certainly 30 years ago, the then representative of the family had it, but of course we're now on to a new generation, and where the papers have gone, I don't know. So it's stored in an attic somewhere.
I had such a lovely time chatting to Patrick and Emelyne and learning more about Catherine Wells and her work. I hope you did too. If you're interested in getting your hands on a particularly beautiful collection of Catherine Wells's writing, The Open Heart is now available to order through our website and available online everywhere. Thank you so much, Patrick and Emelyne.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast. If you like this podcast, please remember to recommend it to a friend. Goodbye for now.